This is episode 238 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined for this week's podcast interview with Jim Peach. He is a professor of economics emeritus from New Mexico State University, recently presented to the Legislative Finance Committee up in Santa Fe. And if I may, Professor Peach, you're widely seen these days as kind of the guru of New Mexico's economy and policy issues. So I really appreciate your time this afternoon and talking about what's going on in New Mexico, its economy, et cetera, in this crazy year of 2020.
Well, thank you for the kind words. This will be fun.
Yeah. Well, you were quoted in an Albuquerque Journal newspaper article about, what's going on in the economy these days. But before we talk about, everything going on, why don't we talk a little bit about yourself? And obviously emeritus means you've recently retired, but talk about your experience and dealing with New Mexico's economic issues over the years and even decades.
Decades. I came to New Mexico in 1980 as an assistant professor at New Mexico State University. And I've been involved in the New Mexico economy almost ever since, among other things. I have frequently presented before legislative committees and other groups. I've spent a lot of time on the oil and gas industry. Be glad to talk about that if you'd like. And for many years, I was involved heavily in U.S.-Mexico border studies. The U.S.-Mexico border region is a fascinating region, one of the most fascinating in the world, I think, where two very different nations come together with very different levels of income and population growth and all kinds of interesting dynamics.
Well, definitely that's something we can chat about later on in the podcast. But, what is your take on New Mexico's economy, more broadly speaking, before COVID hit? You mentioned oil and gas. Obviously, that is a big part of New Mexico's economy, but kind of give us the 50,000-foot view of how you see New Mexico, its economy, and some of the various issues that, kind of systemically impact our state.
You bet. Let me start with the fact that for as long as we can go back with income data, let's say 50 years, New Mexico's per capita income has hovered around 80% of the national average. And that generally ranks us 45th, 46th, 47th among the 50 states in terms of per capita income. We've had an economic development problem for a long, long time. More recently, during the Great Recession, we lost about 50,000 jobs. And it took New Mexico a decade to regain the jobs that we had lost during the Great Recession. In fact, we had just barely done that when this COVID business started. And so we've had an economic growth, an economic development problem for a long, long time. And a lot of those issues are affecting us now in the short run during the crisis, but will continue to have an impact on the state for many years to come.
Now, I guess this is a great time to, possibly argue with you a little bit. I don't disagree with anything you've just said, but let's unpack that economic development challenge issue and kind of the poverty of New Mexico. And, the way we look at it at the Rio Grande Foundation is we're, constantly ranked in most surveys as being relatively economically unfree. We're not as business friendly as most of our neighbors. I would say that we have better weather and, physical beauty of New Mexico, all the things that would make us attractive as a place to live and settle. We share those with many of our neighbors, which most of those neighbors are, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, whatever it is, fast growing and getting wealthier. They have relatively low living costs like we do, but they also have much more dynamic economies. Now,
and this is fun. Uh, let me explain a little bit about uh, economic development, and we should distinguish between economic growth and economic development. Economic growth is merely the increase in some quantitative measure like employment or income. Economic development generally implies a transformation of the economy and of all of society. Gunnar Myrdal, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist, defined development as the upward movement of an entire society. A little bit vague, but he explained kind of what he meant by that. Now, let me explain a little bit about the things that our surrounding states have that contribute to economic development. And among those are educational systems, workforce training systems, higher education, better infrastructure in terms of transportation, certainly in broadband. We are one of the least wired states in the nation. We have a lot of assets. I mean, this is the land of enchantment. It is a gorgeous place. But we also need to make some investments in our state parks and our rest areas and lots of other things like that. If you look at economic development success stories around the nation over the last several decades, many of them, not all, but many of them are centered around truly great research universities. You can think of North Carolina and the Research Triangle. You can look at Boston and Loop 128. You can look at Silicon Valley. You can even look closer to home. You can look at the Austin, Texas metropolitan area, Denver, Boulder, and in Arizona, ASU, and in Tucson, the University of Arizona. And you can ask yourself, what is the difference? And one difference is that all of those places have really great research universities. They go out and pay the money that's necessary to hire Nobel Prize winners in a lot of different fields. We have really good universities, but we're not in that league. We don't play in the major leagues. All of those places have had success in large part because of their affiliation with major research universities. If you talk to business people in Arizona and in Texas, they also complain about business regulation and the kinds of things that you mentioned, but that's overcome when you have the right kind of infrastructure, and a good part of that is what universities do. If you look at Austin, Texas, they also invested heavily into hike and bike paths throughout the city that you can go almost anywhere in Austin on a bicycle or walking. It requires some investment in it. And that's been the case for decades with many, many success stories.
Fair enough. and we could easily get bogged down in arguing these points. I will definitely throw out there a 2017 article from UNM's former president, and I'm going to butcher his name, but Chayuki Abdallah. I
Oh,
know,
yes.
and he was quoted in the journal. And the statistics are that New Mexico spends quite a bit on higher education, but he definitely had what I thought were some constructive critiques, especially coming as they were from somebody on the inside. He said, and this is a quote from the journal article, "Our higher ed spending is more than most other states. The trouble is we don't spend it wisely, and we spread it across so many entities. We do need a plan. We have a lot of branch campuses. It seems like maybe reading through the tea leaves and trying to go for some agreement here is that New Mexico's higher ed institutions could focus their resources more on recruiting excellent professors and top level academics rather than maybe spreading money throughout so many different geographical locations. And, maybe happy to have your comments on this,
Absolutely. I think he was absolutely correct. I've been saying it for years. More recently, you can even hear outgoing Senator John Arthur Smith saying the same thing, but let me say it more explicitly. We have far too many universities and community colleges for a state this size. If you were to start over again and build this system from ground zero, you would probably end up with 2 or 3 4-year and research institutions, UNM, New Mexico Tech, and NMSU, and we would cut out many of our 22 community colleges. We just have too many of them. And it is not that higher ed chooses to spread the money around. It is the state legislature that does that.
Sure.
What legislator wants to go into Silver City and say, we've got to close Western, or go to Las Vegas and say, we've got to close Highlands University? None of them want to do that. Once they're established, it is very difficult anywhere to shut them down.
No doubt about it. And that actually to the point. Sorry, go ahead.
We could spend this, you are correct. We could spend the same amount of money and do a lot better for the state.
Right. And thanks for that. I'm glad that we had some level of agreement there. And we'll just move on from that point. I actually want to talk to you about economic development. And, when the Rio Grande Foundation looks at New Mexico's economy, it's a double-edged sword with regard to oil and gas. And we're certainly not in the let's keep it in the ground contingent. And the same can be said for the federal government. Those are two big, we're like a two-legged stool. That's the metaphor I've used before. Of course, two-legged stools being a suboptimal stool. But
we might disagree on a lot of things, but both, no problem with that.
Right. Well, of course, 40% or so of our revenue, depending on the year, comes from oil and gas. And that is an industry that, for all its importance, policymakers don't have to do a lot of, to make New Mexico friendly to oil and gas. They just have to, kind of watch the checks roll in. Federal government is in many ways the same kind of situation. The federal government comes here for a variety of reasons, historically, of course, due to relatively small population and wide open spaces where they could test atomic weapons and missiles and all the like, good flying weather, all these things. So my point is that so much of our economy is kind of baked in with regard to those two major players. While that's helpful, and one could argue that what would New Mexico be like without even just one of them or some of their major investments, do you find that maybe there's a dark side to the reliance that we've developed on those two major sectors here in New Mexico?
Absolutely. And let me talk about the oil and gas industry for a second. I have looked at and attended hearings of the Legislative Finance Committee and the Senate Finance Committee for nearly 4 decades. In 1982, the Senate Finance Committee was concerned about our over-reliance on oil and gas for state revenue. We've been at this game a long, long time. And there have been people in Santa Fe who have understood that we rely too heavily on that source of revenue, and that historically oil prices are highly volatile. And that was the case. We'd had a big drop in 81. And so these hearings were in 1982, and they were concerned about creating fiscal stability without so much reliance on a single industry. A year ago in August, the LFC held hearings in Red River, and for 3 days, that was the subject. Before COVID, before this crash, how do we create stability of state revenue to carry on the functions that need to be carried on? And in New Mexico, about half of that is K through 12 education. We could talk about reforming that, but we've got to have a steady revenue stream. And anything that they look at seems to raise up the specter of tax increases. I'm not sure it has to. We have a gross receipts tax that is commonly referred to as a Swiss cheese tax because there's so many holes in it, so many exemptions and exceptions. Governor Richardson lowered the state income tax. Governor Martinez, to be nonpartisan here, lowered the corporate income tax. We had virtually no property tax in the state. And there are many, many ways of looking at this, but we need to provide the essential functions of state government. We could argue about what those are, but this has been an ongoing problem for 40 years. It's been recognized by people in both parties in the legislature, but we've never really done anything serious about it.
No doubt about it. I agree. I mean, I know we have a conversation about some of those core functions of government and how and whether they're adequately being provided. I mean, New Mexico, by all indicators, does spend a lot, relatively high proportion of dollars, at least relative to the incomes here, which, as you said, are pretty low. Before we kind of get moved on to COVID and the current economic situation, do you think it's just a lack of overall government spending here in the state, or do you think that there's some other cause for why maybe some of these more elemental and basic infrastructure items are not as good as they are in our neighboring states or just in general in other states?
It is. I think it's a combination. I think part of it, half of our state budget goes to K through 12 and now pre-K through 12 education, right at 50% of it. That's a little bit unusual because in a lot of states, public education is not financed by state government. It's financed in another mechanism. So state to state comparisons are kind of difficult. We've already talked about higher education. If you add in public safety, prisons, the courts and the like, you've got pretty much the state budget. I argued, even when I first moved here, that New Mexico needed to go for excellence in all kinds of things. Excellence in higher ed, excellence in K through 12, excellence in our state parks, if we were to be serious about this. And the reaction I always got was, we can't afford it. And my reply always has been, we can't afford not to do it. You know, even if you were talking about operating in the business world, you have to make investments. You have to spend some money to make some money, is a simple way of putting that. And we haven't done the kinds of things for infrastructure that we need to do to bring us in to the 21st century and to make us competitive with our neighboring states.
Fair enough. I think we'll just leave that there. Otherwise, we could
do an argument about what we need, but
yeah, I really do want to move on to kind of what's going on in New Mexico currently with regard to, you know, of course, the COVID-19, the budget in general, and kind of where you see things heading. In the journal article, you specifically mentioned oil and gas. You've kind of touched on that. So why don't you just kind of provide, again, a broad survey of where things stand? Of course, the stimulus money seemed to be something you cited, and I think rightly so, again, as keeping us on a relatively even keel. But give us the review of the first 7 months or so of 2020, and then where you see things heading from here, economically speaking.
Sure. In August, we don't have September data for the labor market yet, but in August we were about 70,000 jobs, a little over 70,000 jobs, non-farm payroll jobs, below where we were in January and February of this year, 70,000. As I indicated before, it took us a decade to get out of the Great Recession, and that was a loss of only about 50,000 jobs. My friends at the Bureau of Business and Economic Research say that it will be 2025 before the state regains the level of employment it had just before COVID hit. We're in trouble. The oil and gas industry that we've talked about a little bit before, there was too much oil on the market a year ago. There was too much oil long before anyone had ever heard of COVID. And COVID, of course, has hit the demand side of oil and gas worldwide, not just here, but worldwide. And we now have $40 oil. $40 oil is not high enough for most E&P, exploration and production firms, to drill a new well. And the way fracking and horizontal drilling work, you've got to keep drilling to keep production up. We've done remarkably well on the production side, but we had a lot of excess capacity here to begin with, and a whole lot of drilled but uncompleted wells. But we're down in active rig counts from a high of 117 in mid-March to, I think it was 41 last Friday when Baker Hughes releases those numbers. No one I know in the oil industry is predicting that we will have $60 or $70 oil anytime in the next year or so. We're stuck because there's so much oil worldwide on the market already. That's not a healthy situation for the oil companies. And the service companies that complete the wells and do a lot of the work, they're all in trouble, including the big ones, are laying off employees. One large one, Schlumberger, just sold its fracking unit. Said, we're going to get out of that business. The oil industry faces some serious challenges. So does our tourism industry, which just before the beginning of the COVID crisis, we had right at 100,000 people working in hotel, restaurant, and tourism. And that's taken a big hit, as you know, and has taken a big hit nationwide. We're still down about 25,000 workers in that industry, and that's not likely to come back soon. Even if there were no restrictions, everybody wants to reopen the economy, but I would still be reluctant to go inside in a restaurant and eat in an enclosed space. It's just dangerous, and people recognize that. The airline industry is in trouble, and that also affects New Mexico. But it affects New Mexico in a peculiar way because the demand for jet fuel is way, way down. And out of each 42-gallon barrel of oil, you usually get 8 or 9 gallons of jet fuel. And some of that can be adjusted at the refinery level, but not completely. We face some tough times in those industries. And I've lost your photo, but that's all right. Are you still there? Paul, I've lost you.
Broadband.
You're back. I lost you completely there for a couple of minutes.
Yeah. So, Professor, you were starting to talk about tourism. When Wally does his magic, I'll make a joke about. So we had a little broadband issue there. Getting to Professor points about the challenges of lacking broadband in New Mexico, and that's just the way it goes these days. But Professor Peach, before we lost you briefly, you were talking about tourism. And I definitely want to follow up with you about oil and gas, but I don't want to interrupt your point that you were making. So if you could just restart your discussion about the tourism situation. Of course, this is more directly related to COVID-19, but please do share what's going on with tourism in New Mexico.
And the current economic situation generally is related to COVID-19. But we've taken a big hit in employment in the tourism industry, hotels, restaurants, casinos, and it's going to take a while for that to come back. And let me shift gears just a little bit. People frequently ask me, when will we return to a pre-COVID economy? And the answer is, we will not. The economy will be very, very different. It'll be different in terms of consumer demand. It'll be different in terms of how we work. Think of work from home and many other issues. It'll be different in terms of commuting patterns. And in many sectors of the economy, large businesses will become even larger. We'll have more concentration by sector, and many, many small businesses will no longer exist. Large businesses currently have the resources to withstand a lot of these shocks that we're going through. Many small businesses do not. And if you'd like me to, I can.
Well, let's
be the same economy.
Let's talk about oil and gas, because I think it's pretty evident that the challenges facing that particular industry are not going away anytime soon. Like if magically a vaccine for coronavirus came out tomorrow and everybody took it in a month, that maybe helps oil and gas solve, say, the airline issue where jet fuel is not really being used much these days because airline traffic's down. But what I'm gathering from your written comments and just in talking to you is that the oil and gas industry, not just here in New Mexico but around the world, faces a supply glut, and COVID-19 ending could help that, but there's still long-term issues there.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay.
And some of those long-term issues are more apparent than others. There is about half of the oil that we produce goes into gasoline. You get 19 or 20 gallons of gas out of a barrel of oil. Automobiles are becoming more efficient. Even internal combustion engine automobiles are becoming much more efficient. We've got electric vehicles coming down the road, and that's not an immediate threat. Last year, we sold 1.6% of the vehicles in the United States sold were electric vehicles, plug-in electrics. And it's going to take a while for that to increase, despite the pronouncements of Elon Musk and Tesla that they're going to do this in a hurry. That's going to be slow in coming, partly because of range anxiety, the distance that those things can drive without being recharged. Now, but worldwide, there are kind of shifts away from fossil fuels altogether. Coal is essentially a dead industry, not just here. In the UK, they had their first 2 months ever of generating electricity without burning a single pound of coal. The UK was one of the world's largest consumers and producers of coal. And if you read the industry literature, the Oil and Gas Journal and other things that the industry puts out, they are all talking about a long run increase or decrease in the demand for fossil fuels. Not only for environmental reasons, but for kind of the demographics of society in the US. We're not going to have the same kind of demand. If you asked about peak oil, even a decade ago, most people would understand that phrase to mean a peak in supply, and they were still worried about running out of oil. If you use that phrase today, people are talking about peak demand. And there have been any number of articles even in the last few months saying that we may have reached peak demand for oil and gas. And for an industry that has depended for the last 9 or 10 years on growth in production, a peak in demand, that's a really big thing.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And that'll trickle down to New Mexico's economy. Just kind of to sew that point up, do you have any kind of final thoughts on just how big of an economic issue oil and gas is going to be for New Mexico, and it's presumed, kind of the low prices, ongoing production, maybe not being as robust. What does that look like when the folks in Santa Fe get together for the budget?
Oh, it's a major issue, as you pointed out earlier, and you were correct. In the last 2 or 3 years, through FY19 at least, we've had nearly 40% of the budget, 39% of the budget, the state revenue comes directly from oil and gas. And that'll be a huge hit on the state budget. We've got to find a way to generate the revenue to finance the operation of state government. That in terms of the economy generally, it's an odd kind of thing. When you run oil and gas through the models, it is very clear that oil and gas provides some very high-paying jobs in Eddy and Lee counties. 95% of what we produce in oil is in those two counties. But the spread effects throughout the economy are very limited. And you can see that without an economic model. If you drill a well near Carlsbad, that activity, which has a big impact in Carlsbad, has almost no impact in Las Cruces or Silver City or even Albuquerque. And so the spread effects are not huge, but we certainly need the employment and income that's over there. If you take a look at the state revenue forecasts, the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, or CREG, that provides 3 times a year and sometimes more often revenue estimates for the legislature. For the very first time last week, that group provided a range of estimates. And the range is very, very wide. It is something like $900 million, nearly $1 billion out of a $7.2 billion budget. The legislature cannot appropriate more money than the estimating group says that they have to spend. And so it's a huge issue. Always before they had provided a single number. They will do that again in December. But the uncertainty surrounding the economy now is so large that they simply told the committees that they couldn't give them a single number with any degree of confidence. And part of the uncertainty is they have no clue what's going to happen in oil and gas markets. They have no clue what might happen with another round of stimulus money. Today it looks a little shaky. And how important is that? Well, we've had pretty good luck in New Mexico with gross receipts tax. In fact, in many areas of the state, gross receipts taxes are actually up this year as compared to the same month a year earlier. And why is that? Well, the data on personal income for the second quarter of the year were just released by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And what happened? We had a 40% increase in personal income. And almost all of that increase was from the Federal Stimulus Act. So we've been propped up by the federal government, and that's not a bad thing for the economy. But if that doesn't happen again, we're likely to face really serious problems in January.
Yeah, so let's talk about that federal stimulus. And of course, very timely because the president just kind of put the kibosh on the latest round of stimulus.
Yes, he did.
We may disagree on that. I think Washington has to stop and put the ball back in the state, policymakers, the governor's hands, and say, you've got to eventually balance out the virus and your economies. We're not just going to come in and bail you out of your messes, but kind of spitball for us a little bit, where you see things going if another stimulus happens, and what might happen to New Mexico's budget if a stimulus doesn't happen. And I realize this has a lot to do with what happens in November and the elections and various other things, but kind of
you bet.
Walk us through that.
You bet. Okay, if there is no stimulus, what's going to happen to the New Mexico economy is that we're going to see a decrease in personal income. We will see a decrease in consumer expenditures. And in terms of the budget, we will see a decrease in terms of gross receipts taxes and personal income taxes. And we'll have a huge budget crisis come January. If there is a stimulus, that'll prop us up a little bit. Fortunately, right now, we have ample reserves in a fund that was created just 3 years ago, a true rainy day fund that the legislature created. And that ended fiscal year 20 with 29% of the state budget in a reserve fund. So we can withstand a hit, but that doesn't help us out of the longer range problem. It just does not do the trick. In one comment, I know you would like to see the feds get out of it. The individual states have a handicap. Unlike the federal government, the individual states do not issue their own currency. The federal government does.
Yes.
And so the states, many of them are restricted to not operating with current operating budgets that are in deficit. So they can't even borrow for some of this. So from my perspective, the only institution in the United States that can help out the states, and we do need to do that. What we're talking about are policemen and firemen and school teachers and other people that we would all consider to be essential parts of the economy. The states are not going to be able to do that individually without some more help from the federal government.
Are you not concerned about the federal debt that seems to be accumulating at an increasingly rapid pace?
Yeah.
I know that's not necessarily your purview.
It is.
Here in
It is. I've studied that for years. I have never lost a minute's sleep over the federal debt. As Alan Greenspan, that really left-wing radical guy, explained in 1989, a sovereign government that issues debt in its own currency cannot go bankrupt. It can't. Now, there are a lot of examples. One is we've been in debt since 1789, and the republic hasn't collapsed yet. During World War II, we spent a lot of money before any of the tax revenue came in to try to pay for it. And that's what we've done with the CARES Act. Congress did not tax the public in order to put up the $2.5 or $2.5+ trillion in the CARES Act last spring. We spent the money. Where did that money come from? It came by the Federal Reserve. It's essentially keystroke money. It is money created out of nothing, and that's fine. That's where money comes from in a modern financial system.
Yeah, well,
so I don't worry about that.
So should we just, at the federal level, just blow the doors open and keep spending, and maybe
Yes.
rounds of tax cuts? And
no, I didn't say tax cuts.
Okay.
You tax for a number of reasons. One is clearly to let the public know that they are part of the process. Another one is to control inflation a little bit, to take purchasing power out of the economy. But we don't need taxes to spend at the federal level.
Okay. Well,
no, that's just the way it works. There is not some limited amount of money out there. It is created. It is created really in two ways. One, whenever a bank makes a loan, it is creating money. And two, when the federal government decides to spend, it is creating money. And that circulates through the economy, and that's all a good thing.
So no worries about inflation or the loss of consumer purchasing power. Essentially creating new money is.
I don't worry about inflation very much. It's a possibility at some point if we do what the chair of the Fed yesterday, Powell, said. It is possible to overstimulate the economy and drive up prices, but he didn't see that happening anytime soon. And in fact, over the last decade, since more than a decade, since the start of the Great Recession, we've heard predictions that we were running such large deficits that we would inevitably have hyperinflation. And it has not occurred. It has not occurred because there's a lot of slack in the economy. If we get to a situation where we're at more than full employment and we're running up against some sort of resource constraint, we might indeed have inflation. But not even the Fed. They just revised their guidelines on what an acceptable level of inflation was. And they've been looking for it for forever, and they can't find it anywhere. So when that happens, come back, we can have a discussion about it. But it's not happening now.
Fair enough. All right. Well, before we let you go, any last points that you want to make about where things stand here in New Mexico and with the economy as we try to recover?
We have a long way to go to get out of this, and I'm generally optimistic. I'm a Cubs fan, which is a statement of optimism. But we have some really hard work to do in this state, not only for the state budget, but for the people of New Mexico, the unemployed, the school kids who have no access to broadband, and who knows how long most of them are going to be experiencing some sort of distance education. We have a lot of things to address, and let's hope that they can do that in the legislature.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, Professor Jim Peach. He is still available in terms of his contact information at his NMSU website. I also encourage folks to check out not a column, but article by Dan McKay of the Albuquerque Journal, Professor Virus Reshaping NM Economy is the title of that from the Albuquerque Journal. So again, thanks for your time, and glad we had a good, robust discussion. There's a lot of things that I'd love to have a fuller, more robust discussion, but this is definitely a good starting point.
We can do it again sometime. I'd be glad to argue with you about any of these points that are debatable.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.